continuing and dangling conversation about California government and politics. We are through more than a decade of having this conversation at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at California State University, Monterey Bay. And we are grateful and indebted to that fine program for keeping this conversation alive, helping inform folks and bring to them folks in the know who are occupying positions of decision-making in California that affect all of us. We will today be joined by California State Senator John Laird to discuss the first year of the two-year California legislative session. In anticipation of that, what we will do is take a look at this first year of the two-year California legislative session, and also to set in context the recall election that is undergoing right now. We are underway in that effort. So to get a sense of what is the, if you will, state of play in California right now with regard to California government and politics. We'll start with the notion that there is a two-year legislative session. In California, we have a full-time legislature, a full-time executive, and a full-time judiciary. That full-time legislature goes into session following the elections in even-numbered years. So we had the 2020 elections, and now we are in the 2021 first year of the two-year legislative session. 2021, 2022. In that first year of the legislative session, typically the legislature, members of both the Assembly and the Senate, introduce a large number of bills, and they attempt to process those through both houses of the legislature, attempt to get that to the governor's desk for a potential signature. However, the legislators know that they have 2 years to do this. They have certain deadlines they need to meet to keep their bills alive and keep them moving towards the governor's desk. So we are at that place in the legislative process right now where the legislature is within days of adjourning for the first year of the two-year session. They will be adjourning on August 31st at midnight. That is a soft deadline in the sense that it is a rule rather than a constitutional requirement. Legislature is required to end its two-year session by a specific date next year, according to the California Constitution. The end this year that we're in right now is a little more flexible, but the rules adopted by both houses say they will finish their work in the first year of the two-year session by essentially the end of August. For the most part, what is going on internally in the legislature right now is that the Senate is processing Senate bills and the Assembly is processing Assembly bills. Most of the bills have not cleared what we would call the House of Origin, meaning Assembly bills need to clear the Assembly or Senate bills need to clear the Senate. We're not at that point yet where that has to happen. That'll happen next year. So in the first year of the two-year session, legislators are working on their own bills, on their own house, or in their own house. So that then raises the question of how are things going in this first year of the two-year session? Well, what we know is that the legislature and the governor adopted a budget which is operational right now, been in place since July 1st, a couple of months ago. And in that budget, the legislature and the governor were the beneficiaries of a very large surplus that came in as a consequence of two particular activities. One, the decisions made in Washington, D.C. about moving money from Washington, D.C. to states, to local governments, to individuals in order to deal with the issues around economic impacts on COVID. The legislature and the governor, therefore, you hear very little right now in Sacramento about budget. You typically hear about the budget when things are not going well. And right now, the adopted budget, the appropriations and allocations into the specific departments, agencies, boards, and commissions of the executive branch, operationalizing that roughly $225 billion general fund budget, that is well underway. So you're really not hearing much right now about budget because the condition of the state's fiscal situation is quite good. The inside baseball on what's going on right now in Sacramento is that a day or two ago, the Senate Committee on Appropriations and the Assembly Committee on Appropriations did what's called dumped the suspense file. So let's unpack that concept. So most bills introduced by legislators, not all, but most bills introduced by legislators have a fiscal impact on the state of California and its general fund. It's quite unique when a bill is introduced that does not have at least $100,000 worth of impact on the state's general fund. Some bills don't, but they're relatively rare. Lots and lots, very high percentage of the bills introduced both in the Senate and the Assembly have a fiscal impact. And therefore, when you introduce a bill on education or public safety or natural resources or toxic materials or any other issue, the first step on that is you go to a policy committee. So you introduce your bill, goes to a policy committee. For example, you want to do something in K-12 education. What you would do is introduce your bill. The bill would be referred to the Assembly Committee on Education if it's an assembly bill. There would be a hearing on your bill. If you were able to get the necessary number of votes to move your bill along, probably with some changes, which are called amendments. So some amendments are likely, uncommon, shall we say, for the perfect bill to be introduced in the legislature. And you may think as an author it's a perfect bill, but 119 other legislators have a point of view about this as well. So it is very common for bills to be introduced and then amended through the process. So assuming that you were able to get your bill on education out of the Assembly Education Committee with some amendments, you would then go to the Appropriations Committee. The Appropriations Committee is exactly what it says. It appropriates or not money to match up with your bill so that the policy and the funding are there, and then move the bill along or not to the Assembly floor for a vote. So Policy Committee, Fiscal Committee, floor vote, go over to the Senate, Policy Committee, Fiscal Committee, floor vote. Where we are in that process right now is that Assembly members have moved a lot of their subject matter bills and they're sitting in the Appropriations Committee. Senators have moved their bills in the Senate and they're sitting in the Senate Appropriations Committee. Now, the appropriations process is one which is designed to accomplish a number of public policy goals and procedural goals. One of those is to, in effect, create an even or somewhat fair playing field for everyone. Let's say, for example, that Michelle is a legislator and I'm a legislator, and we both have bills in education relating to reducing class size. We think if there were less students in each class, they'd get more individual attention. There'd be more teachers. There'd be smaller classes. We're going to get better outcomes, assuming that. Well, Michelle introduces her bill on that, and I have a bill quite similar to that I introduce in the Assembly. And we both go to the Assembly Education Committee, but Michelle got there first, and she's ready to have a hearing on her education bill in education. She gets that bill passed out of the Education Committee and goes to appropriations. Well, then I come along a week later and I have a bill on reducing class sizes that does it slightly differently, provides some different programmatic elements, but basically we have quite similar bills. Assembly Education Committee hears my bill now and says, well, that's not bad. Here's some changes we would like to see. Amendments do pass to the Appropriations Committee. Well, in order for Michelle and I, this is not a race to see who's first. It is instead a system designed to give a relatively even playing field so that Michelle and I, even though she got to appropriations before I did, we're both there now, asking for money in order to operationalize our concepts on reducing class sizes. The Appropriations Committee then gathers all those kinds of things, just gathers every bill essentially, puts them in categories, and waits for a single day, months of hearings in policy committees. All of these bills are now sitting in appropriations. The Assembly bills in the Assembly Appropriations Committee, the Senate bills in the Senate Appropriations Committee. What happens then is that leadership and the Senate and Assembly Appropriations chairs in their own houses look at how to reconcile. How do we deal with this issue that Michelle and Fred have a similar approach here? They both are working in education, in class size reduction, and they have largely the same approach, somewhat different. Well, the Appropriations Committee is likely to try to get Michelle and I to work out one bill that we authored together. In the absence of that, it may be that one bill gets selected and the other one is held in the Appropriations Committee. Selected meaning, all right, Michelle, we think on balance, we'd like to see one bill. You're not going to do that. Your bill's better than Keeley's bill, so let's move that along. That moment when hundreds and hundreds of bills in the Appropriations Committee are voted on and dealt with in one day is what we just came off of a week ago in Sacramento in the Appropriations Committee. I'm fond of telling the story because it's a repeatable and repeating story in Sacramento, is that if you go to Sacramento and sit in any hall in the Capitol when the suspense files in the Assembly and Senate are being what they call dumped or dealt with, hundreds of bills in one day. Some are due pass, some are held in committee, some are, but they are all either being killed or moved. That if you sit in the Capitol halls on that day, you will listen to a symphony of groans and wailing and excitement and happiness, and some more groaning and some more wailing and some more happiness. And this goes on for hours that day because they're moving through literally hundreds of bills. So in that regard, this whole process of the Appropriations Committee and the suspense file and dumping the suspense file has enormous political element to it. Enormous political element. The most obvious political element this year, in my view, is that the appropriations committees are holding bills that could be very problematic for the governor in the recall election. A number of bills got held there in order to avoid having the governor have to have bills on his desk over the course of the next few weeks that would cause grief or headache in some significant way for the governor. So the appropriations suspense file process is very political. It is also very policy oriented. I don't want to make it sound like it's a completely political, non-substantive exercise. It is not. But this year in particular, it has, shall we say, an excess of political motivation in dumping the suspense file. So in that regard, since we have touched on the governor and the recall, let's take a little look at that here. What we know is that the governor is facing a recall, which has been underway for a while now and will continue and culminate, culminate in a deadline of the election on September 14th. Now, that election is, of course, a two-question election. One, whether or not the governor should be recalled, yes or no, irrespective of how you vote on that question. The second question is, if the governor is recalled, who do you support to replace the governor? Your ballot is not spoiled if you simply vote on the first question and don't vote on the second, that's fine. You don't vote on the first, but you want to vote on the second, that's fine. You can't spoil your ballot by only voting on one of those, but it is two questions. Should the governor be recalled? Then whether or not the governor is recalled, who would you prefer in the event that he does? So in that regard, on the second question, as you know, the first question is simple. It's a binary choice. So a majority of those participating will prevail in terms of their desire to either recall or not recall the governor. A majority of those voting. Second question, let's assume for a moment the governor is recalled. The first question obtains a majority vote. In that event, then the person with the highest number of votes among the 45 or so candidates on the ballot will become the governor upon certification of the election. So you very well could have a situation where the governor is recalled and the governor's replacement is getting 23, 25, 27% of the overall vote. In other words, someone who is 75% of the voters who took the initiative to vote will not get their way. But that is how the recall works. And it's not a surprise to Californians. They have been through this before at the state level, and some have been involved in this at the local level as well. So recall elections are a little unusual, or quite unusual in that way, that someone with a very distinct minority of the votes could become the chief executive of the state of California. In this particular election, there has been about $8 million raised and spent for yes on the recall, about $8 million to date. The no campaign has a $62 million war chest. $8 million yes, $62 million no. And you can see that in radio, television, social media, advertising by the two sides, if you will, on this question of whether or not to recall the governor. The Democrats are framing this issue up. The Republicans are framing this issue up. The Republican approach is one in which it is not being approached as a partisan issue. The Republicans who offer themselves as an alternative understand that if they make a hard partisan appeal, that what will happen is they will not get a large number of votes or even a significant portion of the votes from those folks who are, let's say, independent or Democrats up for grabs. The need here is for folks such as Larry Elder, Caitlyn Jenner, Kevin Falconer, etc., for them to try to go at this as the governor is not a good manager of the executive branch. Not that he's a Democrat and he's a terrible person. Instead, that he's not a competent manager. And we'll go into the issues that are ripe for use by campaigns that are directing their efforts like that. What you see on the Democratic side is that the governor, the labor unions, and others who are opposing the recall and supporting the governor, they're absolutely making this a partisan issue. California is one of the bluest of blue states, so it makes all kinds of sense from a strategic point of view for a Democratic governor and the governor's Democratic supporters to frame this up as an issue of disgruntled Trump supporters who cannot win a statewide election under normal circumstances, so they are abusing the recall process in order to put a governor into place who couldn't become the governor under any other circumstances. So the Democrats are absolutely making this a partisan issue, and the Republicans are trying to steer away from partisanship and instead make it about the governor is not a good manager. So that is rolling out, and that's the environment, and we'll go through some of the issues. That's the environment in which this is being conducted. So query when you have got Democrats with essentially a 2-to-1 registration advantage over Republicans, and decline to state being a larger portion of the electorate than Republicans. In other words, Democrats decline to state, Republicans is the hierarchy of voter registration. How is it that a party that is a minority could be able to recall a governor then in California? Well, the answer is it's about enthusiasm. About enthusiasm. The folks who are the most committed and enthusiastic about the recall are very, very motivated. They do see this as the one opportunity or an opportunity that is rather unique in order to be able to break through the solid blue wall in California and embed a Republican governor in California. They're very enthusiastic about that. They totally understand what the dynamic and opportunity is, and they want to avail themselves of that. So a high voter turnout among that group and among decline to states who may be former Republicans who didn't like the direction the party was taking in the last few years, but they're still relatively conservative, consider themselves not part of the new Republican Party, which has some tones of bigotry and homophobia and all kinds of other issues. Those folks who left, who say, I didn't leave the Republican Party left me. And you hear that a fair amount among decline to state voters. But that group of voters, Republicans and DTSs who are former Republicans, do in fact have a high level of enthusiasm about this and will participate in the all-mail, MAIL, ballot election that is currently being conducted in the state. Democrats are going to use those who are opposed to the recall and supporting the governor, folks including Reed Hastings from Netflix and labor unions are pouring vast amounts of money in to defeat the recall. Their issue is to try to jack up enthusiasm among Democrats to do the simple activity of filling out the ballot that was mailed to them and sending it back. That is not always the easiest thing to do. It may be an easy thing to do, actually, but in terms of encouraging people to do that easy thing, the Democrats always have a bit of difficulty on that because Democratic voters, we know this to be true, that voting goes up with age and income. Democrats have younger, less affluent voters tend to be Democrats. So even though Democrats have a large advantage in registration, they customarily have a bit of a disadvantage in terms of natural turnout that does not have to be reinforced and reinforced and reinforce the importance of that. So the governor and his folks are working on exactly that issue, turnout of Democrats, undertaking very comprehensive and expensive efforts to do so. The context in which this is unfolding is one that I think is quite worth our discussion. You remember that when the governor's opponents were first working, they were trying to gather the signatures. That got extended for them by a judge who said, given COVID and the difficulties that places on gathering signatures within the given time frame, the court extended the period of time to gather signatures. That inured to the benefit of the recall folks in that they then were able to collect the requisite number of signatures and force a recall, even though all of that was done in the context of COVID. And so it's really, credit where credit is due, a rather substantial feat to be able to gather that number of signatures. And certainly the extension of the deadline was to the advantage of those who want to recall the governor. At that time, the governor was being criticized for his overall management. Then it turned into a COVID management debate and discussion. And now it has all kinds of elements as we enter as we are in the actual rolling election phase for 30 days here, where we are about halfway at this point. The governor is looking at a number of issues that are causing great concern and unrest. And they're pretty obvious, but that's what us former elected officials are good at. We can state the obvious. The drought is very high priority issue. California water has always been an issue ever since our state was founded in 1849, joined the Union in 1850. And as Samuel Clemens once observed, in California, whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting over. And that has that clever and amusing line has been relevant ever since then and continues to be relevant to this day. We know that the water, such as it is, falls in the north and the agriculture is in the middle and the people are in the south. And so there's always a push-pull about how much water is there, what is it available to serve, how about the agriculture canal versus the people canal, going from north to south to move our water from where it is or used to be to where it is needed. That was the old debate around water in California. It has gotten more complicated in recent years with the drought, for example, these repeated multi-year droughts. Groundwater has been overpumped. Subsidence has caused actual pancaking of groundwater basins. The storage concepts back in the 50s and 60s of building the dams on major rivers in the north to be able to impound both rainwater and snow water melt, those are under great challenge. No rain, not much rain anyway, very little snowpack. What there was melted off pretty early. So there is an actual water supply problem. The water from the Colorado River, there's debates and discussions over that going on among the California, Colorado River Basin states. So the drought is a very major issue. It affects agriculture, urban communities, suburban communities, et cetera. In fact, it's so serious at this point that there's a small town in the San Joaquin Valley, the city of Teviston, which literally, not figuratively, literally has no water. Turn on the tap, no water comes out. They are bringing in all their water every day. In 2021, in California, in the United States of America. It's an extraordinary, iconic image of what's going on in California relative to the drought and water. The fires, which are a related issue because of climate change, we see the fires being more of them. Fire season is longer. The fuel is drier. The activities associated with that, then wind, temperature, humidity, etc., have all conspired this summer to cause an enormous, in terms of number of acres and loss of structures, enormous damaging fire season, and we're nowhere near the end of that season. That is causing great upset in those communities where the fire is directly affecting folks, but it's also in everyone's consciousness, or many people's consciousness, because the smoke and impacts of that fire are literally drifting all over, not only the state of California. In fact, today I'm sitting in Santa Cruz at 10:33 in the morning on a Saturday, and I look out my window and it's hazy and the sun has a little rosy glow to it. That is all the result of the massive forest fires going on largely in California. My brother and his family live in upstate New York, and they report that fires drifting from California are affecting air quality in upstate New York. This is a massive, massive environmental issue and disaster going on. It is, of course, nearly impossible to have enough firefighters, equipment, et cetera, to be able to undertake containment and then putting out these fires. The fires are largely in charge, and the weather and twists and turns in that are largely in charge of this. But that causes great political pressure on the governor. You've got a drought over here, you've got forest fires over here. They're sort of two parts of the same climate change issue, and they place enormous political pressure on the governor, area by area, community by community, as the effects, which are uneven, the most serious effects, will also affect how people are looking at the recall election. We also know, of course, that COVID is proving to be difficult to wrestle to the ground and get it resolved in our state as it is in the United States generally. The good news for California is that we have a fairly large participation rate with regard to vaccinations. California has about just about 70% of those who are eligible to take the shots in terms of their age, about a 70% participation rate on the vaccines in terms of both first and second shots. So I'm putting those together. Some people still need their second one, but among those who have had either one or two, about 70% of eligible Californians. Well, 70% of 40 million still leaves you 30% of 40 million. That is a lot of people not vaccinated. And that raises all kinds of challenges for the governor with regard to the economy. Should the state be mandating masks? Should the state be mandating vaccinations in certain settings? Should the state be the one that is essentially in charge of this response and trying to deal with it effectively? So all of the issues around COVID and people's hopes and expectations, oh my goodness, we have a vaccine, isn't that wonderful? Now we can get a hold of this and we can return to normal life, and that's going to work out quite well. Well, that hasn't been the case, and we see this more in fits and starts. I try to label my opinions when I have them of a certain kind, try to label them for you, and I will tell you my label, because I do have an opinion on this, is that this has now become the plague of the ignorant, in my view. I think that there is sufficient information out there with regard to FDA's approval of vaccines now that there is really a politicized view of the way to solve this problem. And that politicizing has been unhelpful, to put it mildly, to getting this wrestled to the ground, even with the various variants, Delta variant, etc. Now, the governor has all of these issues, all of them, drought, fires, COVID, all of these issues are his. Now, let me be very careful. What I didn't just say is he's totally to blame for all of it. That's not what I just said. What I just said is they're all his. We have one governor at a time. And so whatever is happening on that governor's watch belongs to that governor. And trying to dance out of, well, it's not my responsibility, well, that's not going to fly. This governor isn't trying to do that. But this governor owns whatever happens on his watch. All governors do. Gray Davis did not cause the energy crisis. The energy crisis was legislation in the early 2000s that was signed by, in the 1990s, signed by Governor Pete Wilson. Governor Davis just happened to be sitting there when an ill-conceived and poorly thought through design for deregulating the electricity sector of our economy fell apart. And Gray Davis happened to be sitting there as governor. Didn't matter if it was fair or not. What's fair is, how are you doing managing this crisis? Not did you or didn't you create it? And so this governor has a number of very significant challenges. Good news for him is that one of those is not the budget. It's not the budget. So we see the governor being challenged in a very substantial way by this recall. One of the major issues in California that has taken on a number of forms over the years is the question of housing generally, affordable housing in particular, and how to deal with folks who are experiencing homelessness as a subset of that issue. Governor Newsom came into office, campaigned for office, and came into office saying that he wanted to address the issue of housing affordability through billions of dollars of investment in affordable housing throughout the state of California. It is an approach based on the premise that you can bend the price curve in housing in California by investing billions of dollars into partnerships to build enough housing that it actually affects the marketplace. That, I think, is fairly, I don't know if easy is the word. It is demonstrably true that when looking at the size of California's economy, the significant portion of the economy represented by home building and the housing industry generally, it's pretty easy to conclude that trying to have the state be a market participant as the way to bend the price curve is chasing an illusion. And so what we've got is a situation where there is no, with investing billions of dollars so far during this administration, there is no bending of the price curve. Housing is not getting more affordable. Housing's getting less affordable. With regard to those experiencing homelessness, you do not see significant reductions in homelessness or its manifestations in most of California's urban and suburban settings. And so that issue is continuing to frustrate the governor, rest of the governor's administration, and to a considerable degree, the legislature as well. What we've got is that virtually every legislator and the governor, during their campaigns to get elected to office, have said, if you elect me to office, one of my top priorities, oftentimes they would say, my top priority is housing affordability, workforce housing, and shelter and housing for homeless folks. This is not a surprise to you, I'm sure. The question then becomes, well, what got done on that? What is being done every day? And there's a disconnect between the processes of legislation and budgeting and programs and voters' everyday experience. In other words, voters believe my eyes don't lie. I can look at this, I can see this, it's not getting better. Even if it incrementally is, it does not appear to people that it is getting better. We know anytime you pick up your hometown newspaper or a regional newspaper and you look in the real estate section, you can see that homes, especially in the major metropolitan centers of the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego, Fresno, Bakersfield, Sacramento, what you see is many, many, many times you see homes being sold for 6 digits above the asking price. So whatever is going on with regard to a governmental response has not as yet gotten purchase to it where it's making the change or the difference. Now, in fairness, we should understand that making a change in this huge economic issue is terribly difficult, and seeing it change is going to take time because it is a very slow process trying to impact that market. So there has been an effort in this first year, the 2-year legislative session, there's been an effort, a renewed effort by legislators and the governor to say, well, maybe we can try a somewhat different approach here. Rather than passing bonds and allocating money here and there and elsewhere, maybe in addition to that, not instead of, but in addition to that, what we can do is change 150 years of the relationship between state and local government as it relates to land use. California has been, for a very long time, and is starting to change, it has been what's called a home rule state. And what that means is great deference has been paid to local governments, to cities and counties with respect to land use in their jurisdictional boundaries. So it's the city that puts together its general plan and its zoning ordinances and its local coastal plan if you're in the coastal zone. There is a relationship with the state. The state needs to approve the housing element of the general plan in order to loosen up particular color dollars to come back in your local community, et cetera. But generally speaking, the state has been reluctant under Republicans and Democrats and libertarians and vegetarians. The governors have been, and the legislature, reluctant to get into the local land use business real directly. Now, in the last few years, and in this first year of the two-year session, it appears as if the legislature and the governor are interested in reaching the long arm of state government into local government's land use decisions. Now, how are they doing that? They're doing that through a series of bills, and I can give you one as an illustration. There is a bill which would say that on a single family zoned parcel, that if this new law passes, you would have essentially by right the ability to put an accessory dwelling unit under another statute. You may be willing to put, not willing, you may be able, in terms of being allowed by the law, to divide what amounts to your single family residential parcel and have 4 units on that parcel instead of 1. So there are a number of bills that in essence are dealing with the question of increased density as a way to try to deal, rather than go out, rather than continue suburban sprawl, deal with the footprint of development as it is and say there's a gross underutilization of existing zoned properties zoned for housing. And so let's increase that density rather than the expense of extending out urban and city services such as sewer, water, and all the other issues. It's a debatable point, obviously debatable point, but what's not debatable is whether or not this is a significant move by the state to reach into what has been heretofore largely an issue of local control and home rule relative to land use. I think this is a matter of largely personal preference, if you will. Some people will look at the ballot and say, well, I'm opposed to the recall and I'm not going to vote for anybody to replace the governor because I don't think the governor should be replaced. Secondarily, if you're a Democrat and you look at the list, you would probably conclude the list of potential replacement candidates. You would probably look at that and go, where's the Democrat? I'm a Democrat. Where's the Democrat I'm supposed to vote for? Well, the governor and the governor's allies spent a lot of time between the time the recall qualified and folks who wanted to run would have to declare their candidacy. The governor spent a lot of political capital keeping any named Democrat from running. So Democrats have this odd position, situation where, my goodness, it's not inconceivable that the governor is recalled. I don't think it'll happen. I still think the governor wins this, probably closer than most pundits had thought a few months ago. I still think the governor is not recalled. But the chance of the governor being recalled, I think, has increased substantially. And it increased substantially after the ability to have a named Democrat on the ballot. And I will tell you, I was an advocate of Antonio Villaraigosa or some other named Democrat running, because it struck me as too much of a cult of personality to say, well, we'll in deference to the governor, we're not only are we going to vote no, we're not going to put a Democratic alternative on the ballot. I understand from the governor's point of view why the idea is a terrible one to have a named Democrat on the ballot. I am personally more interested in keeping California blue than I am keeping it Newsom. But I think we'll end up with the governor defeating this anyway. But that means there's essentially no named Democrat on the ballot. My advice would be this. If you are a Democrat and you are voting no on the recall, and you feel, gee, as a voter, I've always felt that I should vote on every question possible, that's my civic duty, then my response would be vote for anyone except Larry Elder. Larry Elder's the only candidate that has a chance of being elected and adding to the yes on recall. He has a very substantial following in the social media world and elsewhere, and is clearly the favorite of the yes on recall folks. So if what you want to do is, gee, I have to vote for somebody, then my recommendation is, if you're voting no on the recall and feel compelled to vote for somebody, then vote for anybody but Larry Elder, because he is the only one that that seems to be running away with this very diffuse number of folks who are seeking your vote in the recall. What could be done is that a constitutional amendment could be placed on the ballot either through signature gathering, such as happened with Proposition 13 back in 1978, and many other constitutional amendments in California in the last 40 years. The voters can gather a large requisite number of signatures and place a state constitutional amendment on the ballot. Alternatively, the legislature, by an act of both houses of the legislature, can also place a state constitutional amendment on the ballot. Yes, I believe his name is Kevin Pathrath. There's a Democrat who is also has a substantial social media following. He's largely in the real estate business, and he is characterizing himself as the Democratic alternative in this race. And given that there is no named Democrat, he is the closest thing to that, insofar as he is running in the context of a recall. He's running a real campaign. He doesn't have an awful lot of financial support, but he does have some, and he does debate fairly well. So I think he is the degree to which there's a Democratic candidate. I think Kevin would be the person who would be so characterized. Between little and none. I don't think. Let me restructure my answer. If this was a regular election, then the vice president, who was a United States senator, who was the attorney general in California, I think that may make somewhat of a difference. This is not that. The enthusiasm gap is so substantial that the vice president coming into California, let me be clear, will it make some difference? It'll make some difference. Is it going to make the difference? I think not. I don't think there's anybody who come into California. I don't think if President Biden came into California that there would be some boost in enthusiasm among Democrats and those who are no on the recall. I think it out way out on the margins, it may make some little difference. And if it's close, then I guess a little difference matters. But in terms of the vice president coming in or not coming in, or the president coming in or not coming in, or Elizabeth Warren coming in or not coming in, I think that that's at best, that would be have marginal implications for this recall. Executive orders in California are fairly limited in terms of their impact. One governor's executive order can be canceled or reversed by the next governor's executive order. Executive orders aren't all powerful. They cannot engage in orders that usurp the authority of legislative or judicial branch. It's not to say that they're not important, they are. I would say, how much can a Republican governor, if a Republican is elected in the recall, I think the Republican governor will have some, but fairly marginal impact on the state. It will be most significant in the area of the internal authorities of the executive branch, one of which has been noted here, which is executive orders. The ability to fill a cabinet, to be able to direct within the boundaries of the law, the work of the executive branch. It could be somewhat significant. There's relatively little amount of time to do that. The Democrats are going to control the budgeting ability of the governor to do that. The Democrats in the legislature who have 2/3 vote, more than 2/3 vote in each house, will be able to override governor's vetoes of legislation that the governor vetoes. Democratic legislation arrives on the governor's desk, governor vetoes it, legislature overrides the veto. That includes the blue pencil authority inside the budget process, where the governor can reduce or eliminate any line item of spending. Legislature has the constitutional authority to be able to override those with a 2/3 vote of both houses. So I think that the area where momentum in one direction can be changed and shifted is let's say on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the governor gets to be a dictator. I think this is someplace around 3.5. A Republican governor in California, certainly if they're only there for a year, is going to have very limited impact. But it will be an impact that will be significant in this regard. Think of the issues we just talked about: the budget, the drought, fires, COVID, the housing issues, homelessness issues, etc. Any forward momentum, because on many of those, Mr. Elder has indicated very significant points of departure with the incumbent governor on how to handle those issues. So the governor will have some ability to slow down the momentum of the direction of trying to deal with those issues. But whether a Republican could come in and implement a completely different way to proceed assumes that you have a compliant legislature. and you're not going to have that. This will be a supermajority legislature dealing with a governor that they see being there for 1 year. Senator Laird, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, and I'm very glad to see that most of your class participants have not joined you in having a tie on.
Michelle makes me wear the tie. It's a requirement. You can't teach at Ollie without a tie.
Well, I taught a class. I taught a senior capstone class at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Between being in the assembly and secretary, you came and spoke because it was on environmental issues, and I had to get a syllabus together. There was a reading list. I had to prepare things, but I said to the chancellor, who at the time who had helped arrange it, I said, "What do you wear?" You know, it was really a struggle to figure it out. And this was George Blumenthal, who was a chancellor for 13 years and was never outside of a tie. And he said, the whole time, 34 years I was in the classroom, I wore shorts. And it was like, you wore shorts? So it was, I never did that, but I looked for ways. Well, you know, Fred, we have an hour, and that probably seems like a long amount of time, but it's actually not. And I thought what I'd do is talk about 2 or 3 current events, because there's a lot of things going on right now, and then open it up for questions on wherever anybody wants to go. I presented a problem for the Senate president when I arrived on December 7th. And that was, as Fred said, I'd been a cabinet secretary for 8 years. I'd been an assembly member for 6 years. I'd been budget chair for a lot of my run. I could have moved into any leadership post. And she had all these senators that had been patiently waiting to do it. So she compensated by appointing me to everything. I'm chair of the education budget subcommittee, which is half the budget. And I want to get back to that as one of the 3 issues in a moment. I'm on the rules committee, and one of the interesting things about Fred and I being in the assembly is we never participated in confirmations, and so the rules committee hears all the confirmations of governor's appointments that are required to be considered. And we've done independent system operators, the parks director, the head of the prison system. We have really been across the board, and that, it turns out, is genuine government oversight. The oversight is done when we do that weekly. And additionally, I'm on the audit committee, and we have done a major audit, had to have a hearing on EDD and are in the middle of that issue. I'm on the natural resources committee, which is logical given my cabinet service, but then the chair of the Natural Resources Committee didn't come to the Capitol for 4 months because he was remote and sheltering, and you can't chair a committee remotely under our rules. So I ended up chairing the Natural Resources Committee for most of this session. And then I'm on Judiciary, Labor, Employment, and others. And so it has been a lively start. And we also had a situation where under normal rules, you can introduce 25 bills a session, or depending on the House, 20 bills a year. Well, actually 40 a session, 20 a year, or 50 a session, 25 a year. And yet the Assembly limited their members to 12 bills out the gate. And I introduced 17, and once we were moving, and it had been 3 months after introduction, then they limited us to 12. And we had to decide, in my case, I had not lost a bill. So I had to decide which of the 17 bills were the 12 that would move ahead. And the interesting thing is that being an operator, I figured out ways. I ended up getting 3 of the bills into the budget. So for families with family member with developmental disabilities, we got an ombudsman program into the budget, which I had a bill for to do self-determination plans locally. It looks like we're getting the ranch land grazing bill to start a program to conserve ranch land in the state. Looks like that'll get in the budget. And I had a fix for the city of Atascadero on redevelopment, which is a whole nother story. But they ended up getting a fire station out of the budget, which resolved that issue. So one of the ways to deal with paring down from 17 to 12 was to try to do what I couldn't do legislatively in the budget. And I've only lost one bill heading into the last 2 weeks. And it was actually a bill in Atascadero that the minute it got in the budget, I was able to sacrifice that in appropriations. And 4 bills have already gone to the governor. He has signed 3, and I have 7 more that are in play in these last 2 weeks. And one of them is particularly hard, but other than that, it's all a matter of not letting the clock run out with us being limited with COVID and things. And that is another thing to talk about. We could talk about the issues of COVID, but the impact on the legislature has been crazy. We have never, in the almost 9 months I've been in the Senate now, been allowed to have more than 3 Senate staffers in the office. And I have roughly, if you count everybody, I have 8 in the Capitol. There's additional committee people, but 8. And you never can have more than 3 in the office at a time. And that's crazy making, because you want somebody to answer the phones. It's nice to have your scheduler. You want your chief of staff. You want your alleged director. And if somebody's staffing a bill, you want them in the Capitol while that's going on. And so the Assembly allowed everybody to come back masked, like in June or whenever the reopening was. And as a result, the Assembly has had a number of COVID cases and the Senate has had significantly less. And so as much as I want to complain and feel like we need more flexibility on the staff, it turned out to be the right thing to do. And for 5 months or 6 months, we have 40 senators and have 40 seats at 20 desks on the Senate floor. Well, we were socially distanced. So we only had 20 senators sitting at the 40 seats, and then we had the other 20 sitting around the periphery of the Senate. And I'm one of those. And it turns out that was a good thing. I sit right with the pro tem in the corner, the Senate president. So it's great because I'm just constantly having private conversations with her, and the Senate staff is right off the floor. So that is a really good thing. And so then maybe to talk about a couple of issues. The one I think is interesting, and it is coming back around right now, is the whole issue of reopening K through 12 schools in the COVID crisis. And the interesting thing that was the backdrop for this is that the pandemic was changing regularly. So when the governor proposed reopening schools with a plan on, I think, the first work day in January, by the time we came to a deal in the second week of February, somewhere around there, the pandemic had changed. It wasn't a matter of trying to force schools to reopen in heavily impacted areas by COVID. It was trying to provide tools and enable what schools wanted to do to reopen. And the real goal was getting teachers vaccinated, protecting against infection, and trying to decide if there were benchmarks in places that were heavily impacted by COVID and not force them in a gradient and to offer incentives. But we really had to negotiate this, and you know, the governor originally wanted to reward the winners, and it turned out the people that were most ready to reopen were all in affluent areas, and those that were not ready to open were in the most disadvantaged areas of the state. And it seemed really unfair. There was a real divide in how people might be assisted to be reopened. So we did a thing where we basically, for the bulk of the money, 4.6 billion, we set certain rules for how you could be eligible, but we made everybody eligible and automatically get it. No application process. Don't make somebody look at 1,300 applications and delay everything by that process. And we really pushed and pushed until there was an agreement to vaccinate teachers and school employees in the places that might open on April 15th. And so there were some really intense negotiations. I think it was a good deal. And inside baseball, Fred will appreciate the story, and maybe there's a labor person on here, but when we got to the end, this went in a funny way. The governor proposed, he didn't totally engage. And when it became clear that there was no deal after a month, and there's this rising criticism across the state for not getting to a deal, we decided to negotiate with the assembly and get to an agreement with the assembly and then present it to the governor. And so I negotiated with two other senators, and there were 3 assembly members, and the budget chair in the assembly was the lead on their side. And we came to an agreement. We put the bill into print, and that caused the governor to have something to react to. And he did a proposal that really matched a lot of what we did, and it helped us get to the end. But at the last minute, they wanted to reinsert a very brief application process again. So everybody would have to file something that were 1,300. And the assembly said, that's it, we're walking away. And I sort of said, hold on here. And I called Angie Way, who was the governor's legislative chief, who was the lobbyist for the AFL-CIO, the Cal Labor Fed, when I was in the assembly, maybe when Fred was in the assembly. And I said to her, let me tell you what Angie Way would say to you if she were still lobbying for the Labor Fed. What she would say to you is, oh, this is only minor regressive bargaining rather than major regressive bargaining. And she laughed, and then she went and shut that down, and it closed the deal, and we moved ahead. And so when we got to the revising the budget in May based on the revenues, the governor and the assembly wanted to just say, next year, reopen schools, it's non-negotiable. And that was really bad in my view, and now we're seeing why. But although we couldn't have anticipated what's happening now at the time we were doing that in May and June. And I called the governor's chief of staff and I said, I know you just want to reopen the schools. I know you want no out, but don't box yourself in. Don't make public statements that will limit your negotiating ability when we get to this deal. And they finally, even though they really pushed back at first, they did that, and it really helped. And so then we really wanted an alternative, because we believe in certain areas, parents will be really nervous if there's still outbreaks of COVID and sending their kids back. And we fund normally, it's suspended for a year, but we normally fund on the basis of enrollment and school attendance. And we don't want to fund declining enrollment because of the own system we decided for COVID, and that kids aren't coming back to school. In the end, we allowed for independent studies, and the assembly and the governor really wanted that because they wanted some structure. They didn't want people to take an easy way out of the system. And now, since there's been the surge of the Delta variant, the estimates of the number of parents that are choosing independent studies so their kids don't come back to school are off the charts compared to the original estimates. Still a fraction, but I think San Francisco City Schools has 25,000 parents and kids that have chosen the independent studies. And I don't think independent studies was designed for this, but it's like, and so we are looking at some tweaks and some things to do in the last 2 weeks of session. But that is the sort of K through 12. The other one I should talk about, since I'm staring at a CSU person here, and we're dealing with the CSU class, is higher education and what happened in this budget. And it's one of those rare budgets. Well, it's a rare budget because nobody ever has money, and this one was unbelievable compared to anything I've ever seen or known in modern times. But it progressed in strange ways through the pandemic. So the budget a year ago really cut UC, CSUs, and community colleges, and actually allowed them to borrow against future revenues to try to bridge the cuts. In some cases, in some UC and CSU didn't do it exactly that way. And so the real question was, could we just get back to where they were? And the governor's original budget on January 10th didn't do that. It came back partway. And then we got federal stimulus, and we negotiated a stimulus package for the economy and for people that were really hurting out of COVID. And in, I think, mid-February, late February, adopted. And it brought back UC and CSUs to where they were prior to the pandemic. And then in the final budget, we had a 5% COLA. So by the time we adopted the final budget, UC, CSUs, and community colleges were back to where they were before the pandemic with a 5% increase. And then we did small extra categorical things for mental health, other issues. There's this hot button issue in the University of California. It's probably easier to talk about on a CSU call. But there's some high percentage of students at the University of California that are from out of state. And then it turns out that the in-state students can't get, a lot of the applicants can't get their first choice. And the three highest places with out-of-state students are three of the most popular campuses. Berkeley, UCLA, and San Diego, I think, is the third. And they were having between 20 and 22% out-of-state students. And so California families were really irritated that they might have Berkeley at a first choice and they were routed somewhere else. Well, that's going to happen anyway, because it's 100,000 or 200,000 more than wanted to do it. But nevertheless, a lot of things were, seats were held by out-of-state students. Now, you want out-of-state students to some measure because it includes foreign students, it includes people with different specialties, and you want to sort of have that kind of mix to help, but not at that high level. So we finally came to an agreement that the original proposal that I think came out of the assembly was they had to lower to 10% at any campus in the next 5 years, and the state. And you see, part of the incentive for UC is the out-of-state tuition is much higher. So they get this $1 billion or $2 billion extra revenue. So we agreed to buy it out. But when it was 10% at any campus, that's the interesting thing. UC Santa Cruz, I think, has 7% out-of-state students. That reform would actually have them add out-of-state students to Santa Cruz. It's like fixing something that isn't broken. And so in the end, it was to lower in the next few years to 18% or 15%. I can't remember the percentage. Those three campuses only, and buy out. And then we funded 6,500 additional enrollment slots system-wide. So for UC, it was easier to cushion the reduction. So those were some of the issues. And the one last thing, you see, as Fred will confirm, this is a team sport, and nothing ever makes me crazier than sitting to somebody that claims full credit for a long list of 92 things. Well, I'm sorry, it goes through committees, houses, co-authors, governor. It's like you usually can't do it without that. But one of the things, and there are a few, but one of the things in the budget that I don't think would have happened if I hadn't done the impetus, even though it was a team sport, is in the University of California budget, we have across the state agriculture cooperative extension, and we have farm advisors in each county. If you're in Monterey, there's one. And what's happened is over the last 15 or 20 years, it's been starved. It's been cut no inflationary increases. It's a shell of what it once was. And the farmers in Monterey County were about to tithe themselves because they have research on leafy greens, other things that are very front and center for them. They're about to tithe themselves to make up the loss at UC. So I engineered a 40% increase for UC Cooperative Ag Extension, and it will bring them back to where they were 15 or 20 years ago. And that is a great thing. And I've been trying to, I am everybody's new best friend in education. So I do these regular Zooms with the president of the University of California, and he has fully embraced this. He even said when he was president of Ohio State, he went to every county courthouse and talked about ag extension, and he gets it. And I've been trying to get the governor's office interested because he probably, for reasons that are non-state reasons, needs help in agricultural areas. And this is wildly popular. And this is something he could talk about in different parts of the state.
John, thank you so much for that informative and helpful opening statement. And I don't think anyone on this would be surprised that you are busy, busy, busy. There's busy, and then there's busy being successful. So everybody's busy in the legislature, but how do they advance good ideas? You're particularly good at that. Let me use the prerogative of the host to ask the first question. Then everything after that is going to be from our students who participate in this class. John, you've served at the local level and the state level, not just touch and go, not just here for a minute and there for a minute, but actually quite a good number of years in both places. How do you see, as someone who has that experience and continues to have that experience, how do you see this business where the state is having a growing interest, shall we say, in local land use issues, especially around the issue of housing affordability, folks experiencing homelessness, the issues around density, about what are the authorities of the locals versus the state. Could you talk about that for a minute?
Yes, and it's as usual, Fred goes to the heart of an issue immediately. And yet, this is very important, and it's going to be considered twice in the last days of the legislative session. And there's a huge raging controversy in Santa Cruz right now because a previous Senate bill 2 or 3 years ago allowed certain large housing projects to be built by right, meaning they have the right to do it. It's not within city control. The city might be able to factor in some ways or have hearings or make suggestions, but it really gives them the right. It's very controversial. And there's 2 bills right now that would override local zoning, and one to allow a doubling of units on certain single family spaces, another to allow up to 8 or 10 units on certain spaces if they're near transit. And in each case, it would override local land use. And there's a provision in this one of these bills that I find really problematic, and that is SB 10. And it would allow a 2/3 majority of a board of supervisors or a city council to override a voter approved ballot measure in certain circumstances if it might lead to more housing. And I find that really problematic. And so I think the tough thing is this has been going on. There was a very explosive bill 2 years ago, if I remember the number, SB 50. It was Scott Wiener, Senator Wiener from San Francisco, and it would override local land use and really allow for much higher density housing. And it couldn't even get off the Senate floor. And I had it. So The first time one of these bills came to the Senate, and SB 9 and SB 10 in this session are the two, and we moved them over to the Assembly, I stood up and gave a floor speech and said, you know, I was running, I was watching you do this, here we are now. And I've never spoken on this, and I think it's important to make a few points, and that overriding local land use should be our last thing that we would consider. But even if we consider it, we shouldn't do it unless it provides some measure of affordability in part of the housing that's created. And secondly, I can't remember if I said this in the speech, but I've said it everywhere else. The state keeps doing these cookie cutter approaches, and then you look at the individual issues in a district and they don't match. Right. And in this district, it's one of the big housing issues in Santa Cruz is the University of California, whether they provide enough housing so that it doesn't spill over into the community. They now house 50% of the students on campus, but they have not kept up. They have not built the same number of housing units as people they've added, and it just keeps pushing into a contained community, additional housing issues. And secondly, there's this whole system, I don't want to bog us down with it, but the so-called RENA system, where every jurisdiction is assigned a certain number of housing units to build. And there was this one time, apropos all the people that are on this call, there was this one time when I was in the Assembly that AMBAG, which is the Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments, which assigns these for the Monterey Bay, decided that 50% of all new housing should go into Santa Cruz County in the Monterey Bay area, even though only 40% of the people live there. And so everybody in Santa Cruz sued. And so they'd go into a closed session of AMBAG to discuss the lawsuit, and half the members had to walk out because they were the ones suing. And it made it really hard because you couldn't move ahead with a housing element in the Santa Cruz side, and it was a real mess. So one of the interesting factors about this system is it doesn't count dorm rooms. So they have added thousands of units of housing in Santa Cruz, and it doesn't register on this system. And so when there's state bills that say, oh, they're really deficient in the system, that doesn't count. And then in Monterey, you have a de facto water moratorium. So everybody in Monterey is struggling with, you know, the expansion of the recycling plant, of the diversion from the Carmel River, where the deadline is coming up on the state, whether or not Cal-Am's desal plant should be built, public water. There's all these issues, and it doesn't take it into account. So just take extra housing, and if you don't have the water, not our problem. And so my big concern is that there's this cookie cutter approach that doesn't take into account what the issues are in the ground. So I haven't announced what I'm going to do on these two bills, but Mark Stone, who is the Assembly member for most of the Monterey Bay, in the last week split the difference. He voted for SB 9, and he voted against SB 10, the one that has the thing about voter approved initiatives. And while I'm not announcing what my position is, but Mark was pretty intuitive in that. So we'll just see where this goes when we finally cast the votes. We need changes in the recall law, and the question is just, what are they? That is one that makes a lot of sense. Another is to allow the governor to run in the field of candidate, or the person being recalled, in this case, the governor. Another is to lift the percent of signatures or shorten the number of days, because this is so easy, especially in the internet era.
I appreciate the senator's answer on that. I think that this is one of those questions. I answered it as to process as opposed to content. I'll now answer as to content. I don't see the recall in California being abused on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, or a yearly basis. I think it's still a relatively rare occurrence in California. We have those three major reforms from the early 1900s of initiative to make law by the people, referendum to unmake law by the people in terms of an act of the legislature, and the recall of elected officials, whether it's the governor or a water district director. And as a matter of principle, for me anyway, I don't think that there is evidence of, quote, abuse. If a number of people get it together and put a recall on the ballot in California, it's still a relatively rare occurrence. I do agree with the senator. It is easier with all of the social media issues and the ways to be able to gather signatures rather than sort of the old days of standing out front of supermarkets and that kind of thing. But the fact that Democrats, of which I am a longstanding member of the party, the fact that we don't like how this is going, to me, is not sufficient reason to change it.
The one underlying thing that neither Fred or I have talked about, or at least while I've been here, is the whole issue of somebody that's up for recall getting more votes to stay in office than the person that replaces them. And when Gray Davis was recalled, Arnold Schwarzenegger actually got a few 100,000 votes more to succeed him than Gray Davis got to remain in office. Before Fred was on the Board of Supervisors, there were recalls in Santa Cruz County in the 1970s, I think 78. And this horrible thing happened where these two supervisors beat these two people head to head in 1976, and then recalls were filed in June of 78. Both the people that were beat ran again. Both of them got elected, but in each case, the person unseated got more votes to stay than the person that replaced them. And then in one case, then when it went a year and a half or 2.5 years later to election, it was just, that person was unseated because it was never a just result that represented a majority of the people. And so trying to figure out how to deal with making sure that this law arbitrarily doesn't put somebody that's a minority candidate there when the majority clearly feels otherwise is something that is probably the thing that most needs to be addressed. There's a nuance in the answer to that question, because they've all been appropriated for the purpose, but they all haven't been used. And in many ways, it's not a function of them not being released. It's a function of those that are in the landlord-tenant situation not accessing them, and mostly landlords. This has been a very difficult situation for the obvious reasons. People are just strapped and on the edge of eviction. But instead of mandating, it was made sort of optional, but a landlord could get 80% of the rent if they participated. And yet, as that sounds like an injustice, like they're only getting 80% of what they normally get 100%, what they're really doing is getting 80% when the option is getting 0%. And so a significant number of landlords have participated. And this was set to expire, if I remember the dates, June 30th. And we extended it in the end of June to the end of September. And we'll be out of session, so it probably means that is finally expiring. But it is more a function of how it's been operated, or people not participating, than the money being appropriated. Yes, but it's a much longer discussion. But basically, if the state grows by a certain percentage, then any district that goes by a lesser amount has to add territory. And any district that grows by a greater amount has to shed territory. And if there's some particular pocket of dramatic change, like historically it's been in the suburbs where a city of 100,000 will exist where 10,000 people were there 10 years before, there'll be a dramatic pull in a direction. And it appears that the Senate district I have was a couple of percent lagging behind in growth of the state, which means with a minor change of an addition, it could be roughly the same. But the real interesting thing is the Bay Area grew dramatically disproportionately, the San Francisco Bay Area. So, and then it turns out Napa, Sonoma, and the places to the north, Marin, did not grow significantly. So there's a chance that Bay Area stuff moves out to places where there was less. And I am hopeful that it's a minor tweak in the Senate district. And I think the Monterey Bay just inevitably will remain relatively intact. The interesting thing is that the Voting Rights Act was in play for a number of years, which basically said you couldn't disenfranchise voters of color. And that has been severely weakened by the federal Supreme Court and not re-upped or re-strengthened by the Congress. And that is the reason that in the past, Salinas and the Salinas Valley were with the Central Valley and not with the coast. So there is a small chance, 25%, that there's a decision to reunite Salinas in the Salinas Valley with the coast. And then I would have to drop either Santa Clara County or San Luis Obispo County or something. Maybe San Benito gets added back in. That would disadvantage Ana Caballero because she lives in Salinas. And it's my hope that we remain roughly the same. And I think the hard thing for me is the area that is most close politically in the Senate district is San Luis Obispo County. I was the first Democratic Senate candidate to carry San Luis Obispo County last November when there was an open seat. It's been trending, and Bill Monning didn't carry it 8 years before. And I've been working incredibly hard down there. And I don't want to lose it. Even though it's a close call, I really don't want to lose it. I've really been enjoying working in San Luis Obispo. So we'll see.
I think that worth mentioning here is that this will be the second process, second time with regard to redistricting that we have in California been doing that rather than through separate actions of the legislature and the governor through the entire process. We will have a Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission, which will accomplish this task. And this was adopted by the voters with a series of screens in it relative to who can serve on that to try to wring out the gamesmanship and depending upon how you choose to pronounce it, gerrymandering or gerrymandering. My sense, I will tell you, I have much more faith in the district holding together with a Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission than I do with the legislature, because in 2000, the redistricting, shall we say, didn't do the Central Coast any particular favors, and we now have the district that I think is appropriate when you look at the three lenses that the courts allow you to use. As a senator indicated earlier, largely the voting rights issues have been set aside, but the other two lenses are the census data and the rather gauzy concept of communities of interest. And that is, I think, a step in the wrong direction with regard to the Voting Rights Act. But that's a function, as the senator indicated, of the federal action through Congress and the president, whether that's the John Lewis voting rights bill or some other mechanism to deal with voting rights. But the remaining issues or lenses through which a redistricting can take place for the Congress, State Senate, State Assembly, and Board of Equalization are all done under a Citizens Independent Redistricting Commission, which I think has inured to the benefit of Democrats, not out of some manipulation, but through an acknowledgement of the actual trend lines in California, which is getting younger and browner and more democratic, large D, by the day. And the redistricting done by this independent redistricting commission, I think, is a very positive change. Folks who are in the OLLI class know, and I owe it to disclose this, that I was very involved through California Forward in placing that measure on the California state ballot and achieving that reform.
And I should add one quick thing, or two quick things. First, Fred was very diplomatic about the 2000 redistricting. It was a travesty. It really was a partisan one to the extreme, and it really led to the commission. The other thing is to make a very crass political comment. If you look at the voting results last November in the Senate district, I carried Santa Cruz County, which is only whatever it is, 230,000 people, by 77,000 votes, and carried the Monterey portion of the district by about 40 or some, I can't remember, a lot. And so the thing about it is if you hold the Monterey Bay together, then it almost doesn't matter what is attached around it. That will be the driving political force at the heart of the district. Whoever asked that question knew what they were asking. And there was a bill that would have allowed certain transactions within CalPERS to be done privately to make them happen or facilitate them. And I'm sorry, this is really in the weeds, and I can't even describe accurately those kind of transfers, but involves hedge funds and other things. And so this came to two committees I was on. This is an interesting story. So in the first committee, the Labor Committee, I said, I'm willing to move this along for the author, but I really want to know if the board of CalPERS, because they're directly elected and accountable to their members, in some ways the public, if they will be aware of these transactions, if there will be somebody looking over the shoulder of these transactions to make sure. They couldn't answer the question. They said, well, they could ask, and it means, oh, so if there's an unethical transaction going on, they have to know to be able to ask. That's not acceptable. So this is coming to a second committee I'm on. And so please answer that question before it comes to the second committee. So it comes to judiciary. And they haven't answered the question satisfactorily in between. In a letter, they say, oh, they could ask. It's the same thing. And so one of the advocates, SEIU, they said, here, they're wrong. This is a clear statement. They will be provided the information unasked. There will be oversight. And I said, well, then I'm going to ask. I'm going to read this statement that you're giving to me and ask them if it's true in the hearing. So I do it. And they won't answer the question. They won't admit that that statement written by one of the advocates for the bill was true. So I said, well, let me go back to my original question. They couldn't answer that. And I said, and I'm hearing from all these organizations that advocate for climate change that this is bad. Why are they doing that? And then the answer from the authors, I don't know. I haven't seen those letters. And of course, they were copied to me and sent to him. So that was weird. And then there were amendments offered by the retirees group, public employee retirees group, and they were rejected. So I asked the author why these amendments were rejected. And he said, I don't know what amendments he's talking about. And then he said that the person that testified for the retirees group was sort of obnoxious and an overreach. And Well, that guy happened to be from Santa Cruz. I happened to know him. And so I said, oh, come on, you're not insulting a constituent of mine. Would you just like, yes, occasionally he's edgy, but don't do that. And so in the end, I gave a strong speech against approving that bill. And in the end, that's what defeated it in the Judiciary Committee. So it went down for the year after that exchange and those series of events. So then I get a request to do a Zoom with the CEO of CalPERS. And she says, we really need this bill. What will it take to, and I said, what it will take is address every issue that wasn't addressed in the hearing. So if you're going to, so the questioner asks if this is coming back. Apparently they want to bring it back, but I don't understand it. This isn't rocket science. It is like address all those issues. And if you can satisfactorily address those issues, maybe this bill will move. And the thing that's interesting that Fred and I both understand that we try never to talk about is that there are certain times if you ask an author to carry a bill, it's like, oh, why did you pick that person? Because they don't know, they never read the bill, they don't, this guy clearly, you can look him up, so I won't trash him by name in this call, but that guy clearly didn't understand anything about the bill he was presenting. And it's like, and I live in the fear of public humiliation. I will not present a bill that I don't understand. I have one really tough bill because in California, pain and suffering benefits, if you have pain and suffering and you can collect damages for pain and suffering, asbestos cases, and it came up in COVID, California is one of 5 states where if you die, the right to collect on pain and suffering dies with you. One of 5 states. And so I have this very tough bill to allow those benefits to extend past a person's death. And it's now been limited to 4 years. I've moved a lot of the opposition off. I'm still going to have a wild ride in the assembly in the next week. I think I can do this bill. But I had all these attorneys on the phone and things in the hearing. I answered every question myself because I wanted to show them that I understood it, even though I'm not an attorney. I understood it and that I was in control and that if I told them something was true, they could like go with it. And so that is the other half of the legislative process. You want to have a trust that people understand what they're talking about. And if you ever have an author that refers every question to the sponsor and never answers it themselves. I mean, Ana Caballero said to me about one such author in the Judiciary Committee one night, a few weeks ago in June, the author doesn't understand this bill. Why would I vote for it? And so that is an underlying thing when you're presenting these bills. More than you wanted to know, but that bill is very interesting, and I'll be really curious to see if they can address the questions and who they choose to be the author next year. I'm dreading the fact that they could call and ask me to be the author, and I'm going to politely say no if that happens. But it's like they have to address those questions if it's going to come back. That's a tough bill. And it got off the Senate floor with 23 votes earlier this week out of 40. And I don't think Anna voted for it. I think she went neutral. But this is a very difficult question. Mark Stone is the author of the bill. It is a United Farm Workers sponsored bill. And Mark contends, in most of the people that back it contends, this just allows for remote voting in the time of COVID, just the way we've extended it to traditional voting with the county clerks and everyone. And yet the opponents insist that this actually involves card check, ends a secret ballot, and is a fundamental change in the voting process in addition to just do it remotely. And in the hearing, I asked Mark every one of those questions, and he says, that's not what this bill does. But there are a lot of people, that's the Strawberry Commission, some of the growers like Driscoll's and people that are in our area are adamant that that's what this bill does. And it's one of those rare moments where there is not an agreement on the facts. The underlying facts people do not agree on. It's not that you're doing this and I think it's too far. It's like the supporters and the opponents don't agree on what the facts are in this bill. And I voted for it, and Anna stayed off, meaning she did a not vote. And I talked to her about it. She should speak for herself on this, but I think she believes that the bill went farther than the author said. And for a while, that one of the reasons this may come up is there were TV ads run against her for a while last weekend. And there was just pressure from the Senate staff to take them down, and the UFW took them down and stopped running them because it was really unfair to sort of attack Ana Caballero. And she also is a targeted seat. It's like, why are you doing that? It's, you know, the Senate is accommodating you as best we can on this. So she should speak on it, but I think it was a genuine concern on Anna's part that the bill was not what it was represented to be. I don't think there were political games being played. I think it was, I talked to her about it. It was that genuine feeling. And I think she was unfairly tagged in those ads.
Senator, thank you so much, John, for spending a couple of hours with us today. More importantly, thanks for being John Laird and fighting for us every day in Sacramento and doing such a fine job. It's wonderful to have you back here again at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at CSU Monterey Bay. We always enjoy seeing you. Best wishes for the conclusion of the first year of the 2-year legislative session, and we will see you back in the district.
And you'll see me here next year, but I hope to God we're in person. So
very good.
I have come in person before, and even though I had to drive for an hour and get up early on a weekend morning, I still would love the chance to do that. So thanks for having me. I look forward to seeing you all in person.
Thank you so much, Senator.
Take care.
If you enjoy this program today, consider making a donation to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Cal State Monterey Bay.